Hello everyone, this is Michelle again, and this is going to be my first ever book review Wednesday. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to just talk about a particular book that I just got done reading. And this particular book happens to be All Quiet on the Western Front, and it's by Eric Maria Remarque. I just wanted to make sure that I could get that name right. And basically it's about a soldier who goes through the process of World War I, and this happens to be a German soldier. And to give you a little bit of background as to who the author was, he was actually someone who served in this war. So what you're going to get out of the book is probably a very realistic portrayal as to how the war was like for a lot of people, him included. So I think that having an author who just doesn't do research but was actually there, I think is probably way more profound. And I think it allows people to get a lot more of an in-depth, realistic portrayal of what it was actually like. So he basically served the war, and he later moved to the United States in 1939. And this particular book, All Quiet on the Western Front, made him famous, and it actually made him, I guess, pretty wealthy too. And this is also based on a movie. This movie was, I think it won, yeah, it did win Best Picture in the 1930s. So it's a fairly old book, and it's a fairly old movie as well. And I would definitely recommend both. I watched parts of the movie, not a whole lot because I wasn't able to find the movie all of it together, but I was still able to watch a couple of scenes, and I think they did a fairly decent job. So if you want to check out the movie, I'd say go for it. But particularly in this novel, it's a lot about the main character, whose name is Paul Boehmer. And Paul Boehmer is a really young soldier. He's around my age, 20. And he kind of goes through this whole war process. And as he's going through this whole war process, he ends up getting very removed from a lot of what happened before the war, because the war is just so impacting on him and on all of the people that surround him, that it sort of becomes the only thing that they, as a group of soldiers, know. And in particular, we see this affect Paul's way he sees war in general, and how he sees, these really intense and brutal surroundings that he's in. And he as a character is not really, I think, the most maybe interesting, but he's the everyday, and I think he's very identifiable. Once you start reading the book, you can kind of tell that he's supposed to be just the average soldier going through this, and he does grow on you, and you do feel sorry for him when things happen to him, and you want to kind of reach out to him at the same time, even though it's just a character in a book. But he's a great deal of a embodiment of what all these people had to go through during the First World War, because a lot of people that served in the First World War were really young, and so they become sort of this collective body of the lost generation, which is basically the whole generation that was just sort of killed off, because a lot of people died in this war, and a lot of them were on the German side, and they couldn't really go off and do anything else, especially when you're young. When you're 20, and you're just sent off to war. You don't really have a real understanding of your life. You just are trying to find some kind of meaning. And when you go into this kind of war setting, it ends up permanently altering everything that has already happened in the past before the war ever started. So we really do see that really affect Paul's character throughout the entire thing, and it's very profound, it's very in-depth, and you do feel for his character, and he is kind of a representation of everybody that kind of went through this whole war. And again, the author was actually there. So I think a lot what he gets out of this book is fairly a decently accurate picture of what the war what that particular war represented for a lot of people. And what we also see is what I found interesting from a war novel is that there was a lot of separation between the generations. Whereas Paul's character sort of represents the younger, lost generation, there's also some characters who kind of reflect the older, more powerful generation. And what I mean by powerful is that they have more of an impact on how the lost generation is formed and controlled. So they just have power over the younger people. So there's a really big separation between younger people and older people. And the older people include a character named Cantrek, and he is a former teacher of Paul's, because it does go back to certain points in the book where Paul is talking or reminiscing about the past before the war started, before he and his friends and classmates enlisted. So when it goes back there, it talks about this character in particular, and this character Cantrek, I just want to get his name right, but he basically is a character that shows the older generation. He's a representation of how the older generation sees this war. He is somebody who thinks that war is a glorifying thing, and that it makes you it makes you very patriotic. It's helpful. You gain something out of it. He's sort of that representation of what war is, and that's really has to do with just his mentality, because he's just a lot older, and he doesn't really see it through the eyes of the younger generation, who doesn't really have a lot of power or control or say of what's going on in their lives. So it's his character, even though he's not in it for so long, still has a profound impact. And I think this book in particular is emphasized not on really the character's personality, just more of what they embody with the theme of the story. So it kind of goes back to this whole theme that Eric, the author, is trying to set up for everybody. And I want to get this other guy's name right. Corporal Himmelstrass is another character who's similar to Cantrek, who is basically in charge of Paul's selective group of people, like a unit, and he sort of represents the kind of cruelty and power-hungry embodiment that comes out of maybe certain war situations. For example, he kind of uses his power in order to show his authority over people, and at one point he tells his soldiers to stay outside even though it's really cold, and he orders them not to wear gloves. Uh, so when you're out there freezing, and this is in Europe, so Europe can have really, really cold weather at times, and when you don't have gloves on, your hands are gonna freeze. So he kind of, I think a lot of it has to do with just testing people's limits, pushing people on the brink. And I think that's just sort of a form of control. It's a way to control people. And I think Eric, the author, was just trying to show people how this can really affect the way people perceive certain situations, and how it can bring out the worst in humanity. So that's really his point of that character. There's also a lot of other just really side characters that kind of impact with Paul as he goes along this whole process journey of war. So I think I'm just going to try to just kind of list them off, because they're kind of all the same once you think about it. There is Stanislaus Kaczynski, and that's a friend and a soldier, and in the book of Paul. And then some of them are like classmates, like Albert Krupp and Müller, and then Joseph Ben, and then Franz Kimmerich, and then Lear, and then Tajaden and Dietering, who is a friend and a soldier but not a classmate. Gerard Duval, and that is actually a unique character, because this was a man who is killed by Paul's own hand at one point in the book. And then at one point in the book you get a really kind of famous lament by Paul once he kills him, because he's really traumatized by the fact that he killed him, and he feels bad because he doesn't really see how they're different. He doesn't see how and why they should be fighting. So it's sort of that kind of I guess you could say, a attachment that he forms to the person, even though he doesn't even know the person at all. And it kind of leaves a profound impact sort of in the book. And then there's also Lido Levetsky, who's somebody in the hospital. At one point, Paul ends up going to the hospital at one point, and during that time, he encounters that one character. And then there's Mittelstedt, who is a classmate, and then he later becomes a training officer throughout the book. But basically what I've listed is just kind of all the characters pretty much in a nutshell, but I don't think they leave us, I think some more leave a profounding impact than others, but the whole point to get behind them is that they're sort of in the same, some of them are maybe in the same circumstances as Paul, and it kind of shows how they leave a sort of solid impact on the way people receive this whole war process that they're going through. So that's basically all of the characters in the nutshell, and mostly the themes are just related to the fact that, I mean, the basic theme that you can get down is just war is bad. War is wrong. War is terrible. War is crazy. War kind of makes you lose yourself. It's very psychologically damaging. I think in particular the book tries to focus on sort of Paul's mentality, and he a lot of the time he's just thinking about how everything has happened to him as the war goes on, and I think it just goes back to the whole idea that war is just a bad thing, and people should learn from what Paul went through and kind of realize how impacting it is to people. And then sometimes people sort of just lose themselves and don't even know why they're doing what they're doing. At one point, the soldiers kind of talk together and they kind of ask, well, why are we here? And then they say, well, it's because of this, or, oh, it's because of that, but they don't really have a really pinned down reason as to why they're here. So it's that kind of a question that the book is asking too. You know, why do we even have wars? What's the whole point of having war? So I think that's just pretty much what the book is trying to say in a nutshell. And then also by showing like the separation of the generations and how the younger generation sees war differently than the older generation does, and how that kind of leaves a very damaging impact. What I can say as for final thoughts on this book is that the imagery and the writing is really, I think, well done. And the way they talk about the trenches and how brutal that part of the book is, I think the author did a really good job of trying to make us feel like we were there. And trenches, basically, if you don't know what they are, they're really muddy kind of just spaces that are dug up so that people can have like a place of shelter, sort of to protect themselves from like bombardment. And you have to understand that World War I, it was sort of changing the ball game when it comes to weapons and shooting and things like that, because they now have tanks. They now have things that can actually can be used really effectively as sort of machinery. And a lot of it is very, I think, reflective of that whole idea that this is sort of a unique war in itself, because it hasn't been, no war has really been done to this kind of caliber and scale under that amount of technology. So there's a lot of confusion that comes with that, because it's not really that systematic and how we would think war is run. It's very just random, chaotic, with bombs flying off as people are trying to run across to the other side to where the trenches are. And as Paul is like going through the trenches, sometimes like landing on the floor or like landing on the mud, you really do feel like it was a very, very hard experience to go through. And then having to deal with, food shortages and all those kinds of stuff, that's in it as well. So the novel really tries to hammer down the point that war isn't what people make it out to be. And that's really the whole message of this book. And I think it's a very solid classic book. If you like classic books, you will probably like this one in particular. I found it interesting. I found it engaging at times. At some points, it kind of has a lot of sort of philosophical discussion in it. So I don't know, that may take some people out of it or get some people interested in it. I don't know. But what I can say is that it was an enjoyable book, and enjoyable like educationally and intellectually enjoyable. And I would definitely recommend it to people if they really want to dive into into something a little bit more grim and something very kind of raw, because this is written by someone who went through it. So I think that's really all I can say about this particular novel that I read. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. And until next time, I will see you all later.